This is the Rebel Author Podcast, where we talk about books, business, and occasionally bad words. Hello, Rebels, and welcome to episode 58 of the Rebel Author Podcast. This is How to Write Dialogue with Jeff Elkins. I am super excited because I have personally been listening to Jeff on other podcasts, and I will link to a couple of the episodes where his material is talked about. But in today's show, we'll be talking through tips and tricks to boost your character conversations, as well as how dialogue can help deepen your characterization. But first to last week's question, which was, do you want to content market? Why or why not? Julie Westerfeld said, I'd like to. It's an interesting field and a way to promote my work, so why not try? I don't know much about the subject though. I have to learn quite a bit before I try it. Cameron Kayan said, yes, I can't wait to dive into this. Meg Jolly said, Janet is a guru of content marketing. I highly recommend her material, and I could not agree more with you, Meg. She really is a guru. Ian Worrell listened to the episode at the gym and is going to have to go through it again more intensely as it sounded really helpful. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And thank you, everybody, for your comments and your tweets that you sent this week. This week's question then is, what character or book or movie dialogue do you like best? Is there a character that you absolutely love because they have fantastic dialogue? Is there a scene that you loved, perhaps a villain's monologue? Yeah, what dialogue stands out to you from all of your reading, watching, listening over the years? Book recommendation is Nail Your Novel, Writing Characters Who Will Keep Readers Captivated by Ros Morris. I have been binge reading this and I almost read it in one sitting. It's fantastic, and so fantastic, in fact, that I'm going to be bringing Ros on the show in the new year to talk all about character creation. So I'll leave links in the show notes to that. So in personal news then, this is half term in the UK, or at least it is in our county. And so my mum's had Atlas for a couple of days this week, which has been fantastic because it's meant I got time to work even harder than usual. No rest for the wicked, hey. But I've used the time to try and catch up, which I have done, and just to have some thinking space and some thinking time. I realised that my life has been really overrun with administration work for the business, and as you know, or I think you know, I managed to find a VA, a virtual assistant, to help with the podcast, background stuff, but I guess it's kind of made me think about whether or not I need to get more help with other things as well, so that I can spend more time doing the creative work, the content for you guys, and focus on the things that only really I can do. So yes, I guess I will see, I don't know, I've got to see how this first few weeks goes anyway. So what else is new? Okay, so I did a planning day for 2021 with my Next Level Author podcast co-host, Daniel Wilcox, and that was fantastic. We planned out a production schedule for the whole of next year, and it was really good to see that even by giving myself some time off, which I haven't had this year, I can still get everything that I want to get done. Wow, I say everything, almost everything. I'm going to have to shove some stuff into 2022. The only thing is I think I need to reorder some of it. I've got some financial goals that I would really like to hit this financial year. And in order to do that, I think I have to swap around... I might have to swap around some of the, what am I talking about? Some of the projects, because some projects obviously are more financially viable than others. This week then I managed to do my editing read through. So before I start editing, I read through the manuscript without touching it. It's super hard to start with because obviously you see things that you want to change and you can't. You have to write them down. So this was Trey, the third book in my young adult fantasy series. And so like I don't write down, commas and typos or whatever. I just write down like character things, consistency, tiny scene tweaks, emotional tweaks that I need to make, those kinds of things. But it does end up as quite a lot of notes. So yes, I am all ready to start editing in NaNoWriMo. Speaking of which, I have decided I am going to give Nano a try. I am not going to aim for 50,000 words because I just don't need to. I'm not sure if the book will be 50,000 words, but I'm going to be working on my next non-fiction book, which is tentatively called 11 Steps to Side Characters, How to Craft Supporting Roles with Intention, Power and Purpose. Yeah, I almost forgot the title. I think that is the working title anyway. So yes, I will be working on that, and if I can get that done in Nano, then I'll be super excited because I might be able to release it in the early part of next year. So that will be awesome. And speaking of NaNoWriMo, if you haven't gone and checked out the story bundle that I am part of, then you really need to. There are 17 books in this story bundle and a course, and the course alone is worth about $150. And there are books on marketing, on writing craft, there are books on business and audio and writing synopses and descriptions and all kinds of stuff. So I highly recommend it. It's only $20. Oh, actually, it's pay what you like. So you can. The minimum payment is $5 for one set of books. Or minimum payment for the other set of all of it is $20, but you can pay what you like for it. And it's an amazing bundle of books. I've read some of them already, and yeah, it is fantastic. I highly recommend it, and that's at storybundle.com/nano. So I will put that in the show notes. Before we get into the interview, Jeff, the dialogue doctor who is on the show this week, is giving all of you listeners a discount on his services. So he runs a 1-hour chapter session, which is typically $99. But if you include the name of this podcast when you register, he'll give you 25% off. So I will include that link in the show notes as well. Another thing to note is that Jeff has sent some recommendations for books and movies with fantastic dialogue. I'm not going to list them, but they are in the show notes. So if you would like to do some self-study with dialogue, then he's got, I think, 6 recommendations for books and 4 or 5 recommendations for TV shows and movies. So those will be in the show notes as well. Listener Rebel of the Week this week is Bobby Ann Atwood. Bobby says, my inner rebel, when I was a teenager, I was not allowed to watch movies or shows or read books that had strong female leads. So when I got home from school, hours before my parents got home, I would walk the mile to and the mile back from the local library and hide stacks of books in my room. I love that. I love it because A, girl power, and B, I don't know, I'm so surprised that you weren't allowed to read books with strong female leads, especially because you are clearly a strong female woman. So yeah, I love your rebellion. I shouldn't say this because it would probably become, but I do love a cheeky kid rebellion. So yes, if you would like to be a Rebel of the Week, please do send in your story. It can be any kind of rebellion, big, small, or something in between. You can email your Rebel story to rebelauthorpodcast@gmail.com or tweet me at rebelauthorpod. No new patrons this week, but a big thank you to all my patrons, old and new alike. You guys help to keep the show running, and as always, you do chip those bits of coal off of my very dark heart. So yes, thank you so much for all your support, guys. And if you would like to support the show and get early access to all of the episodes, then you can from as little as $2 a month by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. Okay, let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to the Rebel Author Podcast. Today I am joined by Jeff Elkins. For Jeff's day job, he leads the writing team for a company that simulates difficult conversations. As a side hustle, he's been writing fiction for 6 years. In that time, he's published over 10 books and over 100 short stories. His hope is to bring what he's learned about dialogue to authors to help them create fantastic characters and scenes that readers will love. Hello!
Hey, it's fantastic to hear you do that in person because I love the podcast so much. So I feel like I'm like sitting in some kind of like live studio tape of like my favorite TV show. So
Oh, that's
it's
hilarious.
amazing. Yeah, I'm here geeking out a little bit listening to you do the intro.
Oh, stop. Oh, I'm blushing. I'm like genuinely blushing here. I'm so glad this is not filmed. Okay, so I am super excited that you're here, and I'll explain why when we delve into the topic a bit more. But first of all, tell everyone a little bit more about you and your writing journey and how you got to where you are right now.
Yeah, so that's kind of a weird story. I feel like my writing journey is a little different than most authors. I hated writing growing up. Absolutely hated it until I'm mildly dyslexic, and my dyslexia comes from trying to get words on a page. So as a kid, I would write everything as a mirror image. So English was the worst subject ever, and like anything doing with writing, I was just like, this is terrible. I don't want to do it. And I avoided writing any kind of fiction all through high school and college, and getting my master's degree. I just stayed out of it. And then I was in my 30s. It was like 7 years ago. I was in my mid 30s, and I was in a meeting for a nonprofit I was working with the board, and I was trying to convince them of this change I wanted them to make and what they were doing. And um, I was going on in this meeting, and finally one of the wiser older guys that was in there looked over at me and was like, "Hey Jeff, why don't you go and write all of this down and give it to us in like a paper?" I was like, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea." In hindsight, this is a very creative way to get me to shut up, but it's it's great. So I went and I wrote it down, and I wrote the whole thing down as this big allegory in this story. And as I was writing the allegory, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so much fun." And so I started writing in my mid 30s as a stress relief, because it just felt so good to like get that story out. And I spent a year just writing short stories. I was writing like 2 to 3 a week, just cranking them out, just sitting down for like an hour a night and just like hammering out a short story and loving it. And then from there, transitioned to writing novels. And so, yeah, now 6 years later, there's 11 novels up, and short stories kind of all over the place. Yeah, and I work 5, 6 years ago, I started writing full time for this company that focuses specifically on simulating difficult conversations for professionals. So what I've been doing for the last 5 years is sitting down across from uh, a professional in some kind of field, whether they're in the military or in law enforcement, or they're a therapist, or like they're a peer counselor that works with opioid recovery or homeless recovery. I sit down across from them and I learn how they talk. We talk about how at the company I work at Submersion, we're professional mimics. So we sit down and we learn how they speak to each other and what the ins and outs of their conversations, what makes those conversations hard, and then we replicate that. So all that to say, with the dialogue doctor, a couple months ago, I was sitting down with Jay Thorne, who is an amazing author both you and I know, and who's been on your podcast a couple times. So if listeners haven't listened to those, they should go back and listen to them because they're amazing. I think he's your only repeat guest, and he's fantastic. So anyway, I was sitting with Jay digitally, and he was like, we were talking about kind of where my author career is, and how being a rebel isn't really helping my sales at times. So, and kind of what I could do to give back to the author community. And I told him what I did for a living, and he's like, "Could you bring that to authors?" And I was like, "Yeah, I can talk to people about how to write realistic and engaging dialogue. That's great." So, the Dialogue Doctor was born. But yeah, so that's a quick summary of my weird author career.
No, I think it's amazing. And I think your day job must be absolutely fascinating. Like, I have a background in psychology. And so for me, I'm like, oh my God, that has to be the most fun job to like analyze the psychology behind dialogue and understand like motivations and just all the quirks as well. Like, there must be so much, like, such a huge source of inspiration as well for you, like for your own characters.
It's great. And it's I think the best thing for me when it comes to like my personal writing at Submersion is the we write non-linear dialogue, which means anything can happen at any moment in the simulation. What we specialize in is kind of I call it artificial emotion. So we have an emotional model that simulates human emotion in a conversation. But we have to be ready for the simulation has to be prepared for uh, the character we're writing to take any turn in any second and build an emotional move in any moment. So I think the best part for me in writing has been sitting with a character and saying like, okay, at this moment in the conversation, what if this character's feeling this way? And what if this character's feeling this way? What if this character's feeling this way? And what if this character's feeling this way? And like coming to understand like, okay, how is this character's dialogue going to change based on the emotional content of the conversation if it's in 1,000 different directions? Like, so that's really been, I think for me, great in writing because it allows me to take my characters in my scripts and in my stories through an emotional process of a conversation, which, like you said, I don't think is something that we as authors necessarily consider as kind of the psychology behind our characters and how they're moving and how things are changing around them and how that impacts them.
Amazing. And I've definitely just written down another question that I'm going to throw at you later.
Bring it on.
Yeah. Okay, so we are here to talk about dialogue. And I know we've just mentioned a little bit about Jay, but I'm going to just tell listeners some specifics. So I heard about you, first of all, on the right as well, which to my absolute horror is no more.
That's a tragedy.
Oh
that is
my
a
God,
tragedy.
it is. I am still bereft. Like, I'm having to go back and re-listen to episodes weekly just because I need to have them in my ears.
I do still wait for my new episode on Thursday, and it's like,
I know.
oh, it's not coming. Yeah.
I know. Yes, so Jay and Rachel talked about how to create dialogue, and it's one of the only episodes I immediately went back and re-listened to because it was so chock full of advice. I've even shown you the little note that I carry around because I thought it was so good. And so for listeners, that was episode 183 of The Right as well, and I will link to that in the show notes. And then I heard you as a guest on the Career Author podcast, which was episode 143. And I think they are fantastic episodes. So I am linking to those in the show notes for listeners to go and have a listen to those as well, if they haven't had enough of you today. Okay, so you've just released a new service all about dialogue. So would you like to tell everyone a little bit more about that service before we delve into some tricks and tips to improve writer's dialogue?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So what I'm doing with dialogue, you can find it over at dialoguedoctor.com. And I'm helping authors by sitting down with them, taking a piece that they have and looking at their dialogue with them. So the way the service works is you send me 500 to 2,500 words, and then we schedule an hour. I give you a ton of edits, and those edits are all focused on and geared toward not just improving that individual piece, but helping you learn how to improve your dialogue over all of the work you're going to do moving forward. So my goal is that like if I can spend an hour with you and teach you like 3 things about dialogue or 4 things about dialogue that are going to make you a better writer moving forward, that's my goal. Dialogue is the thing that engages readers in your work more than anything else, more than a thrilling plot, more than a dramatic turn, more than a fantastic dragon or the greatest spaceship ever, or like the best world building you've ever done. Your character, the words coming out of your character's mouth is what's going to create intimacy with your reader. So if I can help you do that, your reader engagement is going to go up. So that's my goal. I sit with you. We sit for an hour. We talk about your piece and work through it together, and talk about your characters and the dialogue and how it works. But yeah, so the service is pretty simple. and people can find it at dialoguedoctor.com. And I'm having fun. It's been amazing to meet tons of authors and talk about their work. I love, but selfishly, I get a lot of joy out of helping other people see their dreams and like fruitions come to life. And writing is so personal for us, right? Like we're literally like bleeding on the page. And so to sit down with somebody who's like invested themselves in these characters and these stories, and help them bring bring what's in their brain out. Because the thing about dialogue is that with some technical tricks and then learning to empathize in ways and learning to feel the energy of the piece, you can really take what's in your brain and make it come to life and just bring it realism, and make it more dynamic. So I don't see what I'm doing as actually like adding anything to anybody's script. I see it as just coming alongside you and helping you take what's in your head and bring it onto the page in a more dynamic way. So that's what I do, and it's fantastic to sit with authors and I read their stories and hear what they're doing, and help bring their characters to life. It's a lot of fun.
Amazing. And I know people who have used your service and are raving about it. So I am green with envy, and I can't wait to send you something and have a session with you.
Yeah,
okay,
I'm excited.
So let's dive into dialogue then. What are the most important elements in creating good fictional dialogue?
So this answer may not be what people are thinking to hear, but this is kind of Jeff speak. When I look at dialogue, I look at empathy and energy. So empathy is, can I feel what your character's feeling? Do those feelings make sense and are those feelings coming through in the dialogue? Energy is, there's a natural energy created when people talk. We are designed, whether we love people or hate people, introvert or extrovert, we as creatures are designed to communicate verbally. So when we get into watching people talk, there's just a natural momentum that builds in the conversation in that dialogue. Whether that momentum has a positive energy or a negative energy, right? It's there. That dialogue is taking that story somewhere. And so the second thing I look at for dialogue is like, how are you empowering the energy of your characters talking to benefit your story in a positive way? The energy coming from your dialogue flowing in the right direction? Is it helping you, or is it actually damaging the communication of your piece? So like, how can we harness that energy and direct it in the right place? And then, how can we deeper empathize with your characters on a level that's going to create that intimacy for a reader?
So do you have an example of like, so I guess you're talking about, so do you have maybe an example of where it's limiting and the negative side, like in dialogue?
Sure. And so like let's take energy first, because I think that's the harder concept to grasp, because that's kind of a weird, I know I recognize I sound a little bit like an Eastern mystic, and I'm like, there's an energy that you have to open the chakras of your writing. That's not it's not what I'm talking about. It's actually a very practical thing.
You mean we don't have to take psychedelics and
you don't have to
party?
So the first step to writing with great energy is shrooms. I'm just kidding. I'm not encouraging drug use in any way, shape, or form.
No, nor am I. But it is funny to joke about it. Yeah.
Right. So when we're talking about the energy of your piece, right, it's that back and forth between two characters, three characters, or a group of characters that is going to build build that momentum and that flow of your conversation. So like, for example, I was just watching this week this amazing show on the service Hulu called Woke. That's a new TV show. And some of my favorite parts of the show are where these three roommates are just sitting on a couch talking to each other, because their personalities are hysterical and you can completely empathize with them. And there's just this internal energy of the piece that builds as they're sitting there. And by energy, I don't mean excitement. I mean this engagement where you're listening to three people talk. So ways that we break down energy, to go back to your question, like ways that we harm that is disrupting the dialogue with prose. So if your two characters are talking and every couple exchanges, there's a long block of you explaining what's happening in your character's mind, you are disrupting my flow. And like as the reader. And so like stop disrupting my flow and put that into the dialogue and let that dialogue do the work for you, right? Like that's a technical example of how it works. When characters when characters don't sound unique to themselves and their voice is changing throughout the piece, it can really disrupt the energy of the piece, because we're sitting, as the reader, we're sitting there going, wait, what happened to the person that I liked listening to? Who is this person now? Another example of things that I've seen authors doing is uh, repetitively giving us the internal thoughts of the character instead of just letting us feel those thoughts through the character's words. So by disrupting the verbal flow and like giving us your internal thoughts, it's a security measure for us as an author, because we're insecure that the reader's actually going to be able to hear what our character is feeling through the character's words. So we put in these sentences and throw-ins about how the character is feeling, and these internal monologue about what's going on with the character. And what that does is it pulls the reader out of the moment and puts them in this mental headspace with the character, and then forces the reader to jump back into the moment where they're back into the dialogue again between multiple characters. So what I recommend for people to really work on their energy, like an exercise you can do as a writer to work on your energy, is write a short story, conversation between two characters, come up with just um, a conflict that these two characters are going to have. So maybe it's a couple who is getting separated and one of them's about to leave the house. Maybe it's a kid who's gotten in trouble with their parents. Maybe it's a someone who has to tell who's doing a performance evaluation at work, right? Like find a conflict and then write the conflict dialogue between those characters using only dialogue. No prose, no he said, she said, no internal monologue, no thoughts, just the dialogue. And living in that dialogue like that's going to help you start to feel the energy of the piece, and you'll see how like disrupting it is pulling your readers out of their engagement. So if we can avoid disrupting it with like inserting paragraphs in between the dialogue, hold off like putting our characters' internal thoughts, and just trust that we can communicate that through our characters speaking, and then keeping our characters' voices consistent to who the characters are. That'll help build the energy of your piece a ton. Those are some of the first things I look for when I'm looking at a piece. As far as empathy goes, the question is like, is what your character's saying clearly representative of how your character's feeling in that moment? Right. So if your character's if your character is someone who doesn't make jokes, right? If your character is a serious character, maybe they're a little shy, maybe they struggle to relate to other people around them, and you're in a highly intense moment and your character's cracking a joke, like that's out of sync with your character's voice. Um, at the same, because in a stressful moment, is your character going to suddenly become more extroverted? Like, does that make sense? Like, so keeping your character in line with who your character is across multiple emotional states um, will add to the empathy of uh, your piece and will further engage the reader. So what I like to do with authors is start, I call it a character wheel, because I think of it as one of those like kids toys where you could like turn the wheel to a specific thing and it would be like chicken, the chicken goes blah, 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 blah. And then you turn it to be like cow, the cow goes moo, 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 moo. When I'm writing a piece, I'm thinking about it as that wheel, and instead of animals, it's emotional states. So when I turn my characters to like, my character's super vulnerable right now. Well, when my character's vulnerable, my character goes blah, 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 right? So it's that my character's really stressed out. When my character's stressed out, it goes blah, 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 blah. So what I like to do to build the empathy of your piece is we start kind of at the middle of your character, and we say, what's your character sound like under normal circumstances? Just an everyday conversation. If your character's ordering a latte, what are the characteristics of your character's voice. And then we take your character along that spectrum to the right, where your character is experiencing deeper vulnerability and deeper openness. And we say, how does your character's voice gradually change, never leaving the root of what it is, but gradually build to that openness? And then we go in the other direction. How does it gradually build into times of extreme stress? So what I encourage authors to do is build this spectrum of which I call a character wheel of voice, of like, so here's all the circumstances you're going to put your character in, knowing that the root of your character's voice is always going to stay the same. They're never not going to be shy, right? Like they may grow over the time of books, and that root may change, that character might develop over time of books, but in one conversation, right? Like if this is where their root is, how are we growing the voice in times of different emotional states? So back to the original question of like, what are the issues I'm seeing in authors' dialogues, and what are ways that they can immediately improve, right? Like if we can focus on the energy of our piece and not disrupt that energy, and build a clear emotional model for our characters so that we know where our characters are going throughout the story. We then, every dialogue our character enters, whether it's with a side character or a main character, whether it's just a one-off, quick thing that we need to do to move the plot forward, or it's a real intense moment where we're going to reveal something personal about our characters. If we come in prepared, knowing that like, okay, I don't want to break up the energy of this. I want to trust my dialogue to do the work that it's supposed to do, and keep like engaging those readers in that way. And I don't want to break up. I want my character to, I want the reader to be able to empathize with my character. So I need my character to be true to who they are in their voice. If we can come in with that, most of our problems in dialogues will be fixed. Yeah, so that's kind of where I start.
That's amazing. I'm like, there's so many things that that I could come back on. I think the first thing to say is I love that exercise of doing dialogue only. So I think that's one way that writers can very quickly learn to differentiate their dialogue. So I used to do like an exercise, just where you create a conversation just between two characters, and with none of the dialogue tags or whatever, and you have to be able to know which characters are different. And an easy way to start, I think, developing your dialogue is to have two very conflicting characters, because they would so obviously speak differently. So, for example, you could have a police officer who's going to be very formal, use certain, official words or whatever. And then you could have like, just because I'm British, you could have like a real Cockney, Londoner, and they're obviously going to speak very differently to a police officer. So, and in writing those, and that sort of exercise that you're talking about, in terms of doing dialogue only, that helps. Well, over time, it's helped me see the differences in the language, and then be able to pick out those things to put it into my characters as well. And the other thing I wanted to just bring up is the. I found it really interesting that you're saying, to keep the root of a character's voice, because I think all, excuse me, all characters, all people are very, very consistent. Humans are creatures of habit, but we all have a breaking point. So there are times where characters, you can have a very shy character who doesn't really like to argue or be sort of very outward, and that character can still snap. And that might be part of their character arc, their change, their development, getting over their flaw or whatever. And even if they snap and explode in dialogue, you can still keep the heart of them and their original voice in that sort of explosion, can't you?
Yeah, I would actually argue that if your character isn't changing emotional state through your story, there isn't enough conflict happening.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Like we, as readers, we're showing up to see your character put through the ringer, right? Like to see your character struggle, whether that struggle be a humorous struggle or a tragedy, like, whatever. I don't want the word struggle to sound, heavy, but we want your character to be wrestling with something. That's why we're coming to the story, to like experience that wrestling match between
Absolutely.
your character and the world. So that means that your character's voice should be adapting based on the circumstances around it, because that wrestling match is going to happen. And just to like, so just to take a step back for a second, because I realized like, okay, we just dropped a ton of stuff on an author. And if you're a new author and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to like get a plot down, and I'm like reading Jay Thorne's like book about plot, and I got like circumstances, choice, and consequence going through my head, and like I can't handle it. Like that's one thing I'm thinking about. And then I know I like grammar is all in itself too, and I don't even know where to put the punctuations before or after the period. I'm so confused. And now you're talking about like energy and empathy. Oh my gosh, what in the world? So just to back down a little bit, I loved what you were saying about like the police officer and the Cockney person, because where this starts, like if you want to just start writing better dialogue today, start thinking archetypes.
Yeah.
And practice writing archetypes, right? Because the thing that a lot of writers struggle with is actually a phrase that Jay Thorne coined is monomouth. Is that all
Yes.
your
Yeah. That was
characters?
my next question.
Yeah, so all of your characters sounding the same damages the energy of the piece, because it sounds like one person talking to themselves the whole time, and it damages the empathy of the piece, because we want to empathize with different people, like we want to engage with different people on deep levels, and so if they all sound the same, we get bored. So and the problem we have as writers is that we have this story in our head, and we've lived with these characters for so long, and when we put it on the page, they all sound exactly like us. So the question is like, how do we break out of that? And the first way to break out of that, what I'd recommend doing is writing archetypes. And if archetypes is too like
Just explain
theoretical,
what you mean by an archetype, or give a couple of
sure.
examples.
Yeah. So like you were saying, like in my head, when I create the like ideal policeman, right? Like what does an ideal policeman look like? To me, in my mind, that's the archetype of a policeman,
Mm-hmm,
right? Like,
mm-hmm.
so, and rather than saying like, okay, here, I'm going to jump into writing this character, and here's what this character, and this is what this character would say, like just jumping into that kind of uh, writing exercise can lead to all of your characters sounding like you, because you have all this other stuff going on in your head, right? Like plot and all these other things happening in your head. So you don't have time to actually distinguish the characters from one another. If you can start with an archetype, like a form of a character, I think of it as like like sitting down to a potter's wheel, and you've got a big thing of clay, and when you sit down, like, okay, I'm going to try to make a vase, right? Like, so I have an archetype of a vase in my head. It's the same with characters. Like, I'm going to try to make this kind of character. I have this kind of character in my head. If you can't get an archetype down, I recommend starting with somebody whose voice you know really well. So like
Mm.
when I first started writing 7 years ago, started writing fiction, I would write conversations between people I loved in TV shows or famous voices. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to take this person's voice and this person's voice, and I'll put them into this situation, and I'm going to develop a story around that. So practicing writing different forms, different archetypes, can help you start to distinguish your voices. That's kind of the 101 level. When we get to where we can really do this naturally, we start to shape unique characters, and we move away from archetypes, and we start to shape characters that are uniquely themselves. But the place to start, like if you're looking for like, okay, energy, empathy, crazy, I don't know what to do with all of that, the place to start is start writing some stories where you have different archetypes, different forms of characters that have just kind of base different voices, and push yourself to write that. And that's going to lead you into that's going to teach you the skills you need to start writing unique characters.
Mm. I think I genuinely think that dialogue is such a hugely important part of creating a good book, because I talk in the Anatomy of Prose, I talk about the difference between author voice and character voice is their personality. And if you want to create a character with depth, with personality, that is fully formed in a reader's mind, you have to think about what their voice is, and that includes their dialogue, their voice, be it in narration, in a thought, whatever, in the dialogue, all has to match. And so whatever their personality is should be their dialogue too. But I think that that is quite a hard skill to master, because you're trying to get that flow from, all the way from the dialogue through the narration as well. And of course, not all characters are protagonists, not everybody's narrating, so you then have to capture their personality through the eyes of your narrating character, their voice through the eyes of a narrating character as well. Okay, so how else can you differentiate? How else can you get rid of monomouth?
Yeah, so starting with different forms and moving from there is important. And the key is, so because we could talk about like editing techniques and like going back and reading your story out loud and all these things that like they encourage, but my goal for an author is that they can get the voices in their head so quickly that on the first draft you can get rid of monomouth, right? Like, and that's the goal. So when I work with an author over long term, like I've had the privilege of just doing full books with a couple of people, and when I work with them long term, it usually takes about 4 or 5 weeks to where they don't have to be using these weird techniques of like checking their writing, right? So it is about learning to empathize with your character, learning to ask, what's my character feeling in this moment? So once you have like the different forms set up, you understand that like, okay, in different emotional circumstances, these characters are going to respond differently. And by distinguishing your characters from one another, you start to get to this place where you move away from mono, focusing on like, what's my individual feeling in this moment of conversation, and what's this character feeling in the moment of the conversation. Two feelings being the responses of those two feelings being different, that will start to distinguish your characters not just from each other but from you as well. Right. So it's that goal of getting out of your own perspective and getting into the perspective of your characters that will start to move their voices away from one another and away from you and create this more dynamic and rich conversation. And it all does start with empathy. And again, the goal is that you can start to do that on your first draft, right? Like I don't want to be like, okay, so it takes 5 drafts because who has time for that? So like we want to sit down for the first draft and immediately have different characters. And it is, so what I recommend is really focusing on getting out of your perspective into their perspective, so that the first time you write their voice, it starts to feel different right away.
I love that.
Yeah. See, and to get like a little, hokey, big magic, Elizabeth Gilbert hokey for a second, like understanding, she talks about in her book Big Magic, creativity being a muse that's separate from the rest of us. And you have to think of your characters that way too, right? Like the question isn't like, what do I want to use this character for to push the plot forward? The question is like, who is my character in this moment right now, and how can I really get into their head? And so it helps to visualize your characters as something separate from you and not as an extension of you. As long as you're thinking of your characters as an extension of you, they're going to sound like you. So pushing away from that is important.
I love that, because I've read Big Magic, but I have always thought my characters are separate because the little fuckers don't do what I say. So like, it's so annoying. I in the last book that I was writing, there was a scene that just wouldn't work, and I was like, what is wrong with this scene? And it's literally because, and I sort of metaphorically took one of my characters to the side and was like, dude, what is wrong? And the way I'd written the reaction, so basically, that a mother abandoned them when they were young teenagers, and I had assumed that my character would just want to make up, and they're quite a loving, positive character, and the character, like I say, I sound insane, like I actually had this conversation with the character, but they were pissed. They were pissed at the mum, right? And so when I rewrote the scene, all of a sudden it worked, and I was like, how these? I swear they are sentient. Like, I swear they are.
Yeah, at work we talk all the time about having voices in our heads, about how like you're tapping into the voices in your heads. And before I was a writer, back when I was just like doing nonprofit work, I would hear authors talk about that stuff because I've always been a heavy reader. So I'd hear authors talk about that stuff, and I was like, y'all are full of shit.
Yeah.
So like, I get this little game the authors play of like, my character is an entity unto himself, and I have conversations with him. I'd be like, y'all are just, that is some bullshit.
Yeah.
y'all
You
be
need a
making stuff
shrink.
up. Yeah, y'all
Yeah.
need some help.
Yeah.
So so yeah. Um, but no, it is true and it is real that if you can mentally detach yourself from your character so that they are their own, sentient thing in your mind, then you can create characters that sound different from you and defeat that monomouth. And I do just want to come back for a second to the idea of archetypes, because if we're talking about archetypes and you're like, I don't know what a policeman's like. Let's say that you are extremely introverted and just a total shut in and you hate talking to people. You're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, people sound different from each other. I don't talk to people. I only talk to myself. Um, when I was a teenager, I had the opportunity to go to Amsterdam and I got to walk through the Van Gogh Museum. And one of the things I loved in the Van Gogh Museum more than anything else was his sketchbooks. uh, because I was so like, when I think of Van Gogh, I think of these like, paintings that like have an emotional content, but not a like, oh, that doesn't necessarily, I know that's a flower, but it doesn't look like a flower, but it's, I can feel that it's a flower. So to see that he was doing this very technical sketching of like trying to get people's hands just perfect and trying to get people's faces just perfect really shocked me, because it's like, oh, like he wasn't drawing in this emotive way because he had to, because he wasn't capable of drawing other ways. Like, he actually sat and practiced this craft, and you can do that too. So like turning on a television show you like to watch and uh, studying a character for 30 minutes, turning off that television show, sitting down at your computer and trying to replicate that voice, right? Like,
Mm.
just getting into the details, asking yourself the details of like, what does that voice look like? Because writing is a muscle, right? Like, and just like we have to go to the gym and exercise our arms if we want big biceps, we have to go to the writing gym and exercise character voice if we want truly unique characters. So just sit down and start trying to write those different voices that you hear in the world around you. Like, if you have a relative who's close to you that you love, sit down, or I mean, I hope you love them. Sit down and write the voice that you hear in your head when you hear it. Now, maybe not share that with them, but sit down and practice like getting that voice out and working those archetypes over and over again. And that's going to help you start to create characters that are separate from your own head, right?
Mm.
Like, if we start with the intention of like, I'm going to write this other voice and practice that over and over, we can start to build that muscle, so that when we're ready to write our novel and we sit down and all of a sudden we find our character in a coffee shop talking to a barista and we want that conversation to be entertaining, we can now put a voice into that barista that is separate from our character and separate from us, and we have a dynamic and energetic conversation that's like creating this empathy and this wonderful moment of kind of joy for a reader. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I have in my notes app on my phone, I have a file literally for stealing dialogue. So like when I'm watching
That's
films,
amazing.
yeah, well, like when I'm watching films or a TV series, if someone says something brilliant, or I'm like, oh, that was so weak or whatever, I will literally pause it, rewind it, and type it down in my notes file for like later analysis, because I am
Oh, that's
that
so
much
great.
of a loser.
No, that's not a loser at all. That's somebody working on their craft. That's
Yeah.
what that is. Yeah, that's working out.
Okay, right. What are the most common mistakes, other than monomouth and everybody sounding the same? What are the most
Yeah.
common mistakes that you see authors making with dialogue?
So monomouth is everybody sounding the same. I also have there's one that I think of that I internally called stone mouth, which is my character's voice never changes, meaning that regardless of the circumstances around my character always sounds the same, right? Like, um, let's just take like Han Solo, the like roguish, cowboy-esque character who's got wisecracks and jokes and sarcastic and is a little pessimistic. When the stakes get high, he shouldn't still be wisecracking, right? Like, it's that kind of, but it, and a mistake authors make is he is wisecracking. So all the characters sounding the same, the character's voice not moving when it's supposed to move. Um, a higher level thing that I see authors doing, that I find myself talking to them a lot, is not lining up the emotional flow of their characters. So if you think about your scene as kind of the like rough Kurt Vonnegut-esque plot sketch, where like, Vonnegut said there's only so many kinds of plots. There's like Man in a Hole, where like the story starts high and then goes low, or like starts positive and then goes negative for the character. There's like Man on a Climb, where the plot, the character's like down in the dumps, and then by the end of the story he's going to be this champion of the world. Or there's like the dip, where it's like it starts high, goes low, and then comes high again, right? Like your scene has an emotional flow like that too. And so like a lot of things writers miss is thinking through like, what's the emotional flow of this scene? My character's starting feeling this way, how are they going to feel at the end, right? So missing that like emotional movement of your character, it will happen naturally if you're not focused on it. But this is an editing technique I like to use, is coming back to the scene and being like, okay, where did they emotionally start and where did they emotionally end, and what was their voice at the beginning, what was their voice at the end, and when I start the next scene, should they be in the same emotional state? And if they're not in the same emotional state, what transition am I creating for the reader so that they know that the emotional state has changed, right? Like, so thinking through that emotional state. And then when you start really having fun with it, you start asking, what are the emotional states of all the characters in the scene, right? So a lot of times I find protagonists and antagonists should be in the reverse. So if the protagonist is super happy at the beginning of the scene, the antagonist should be upset, or vice versa. If the antagonist is super happy at the end of the scene, the protagonist should be upset, right? Like we should see them crossing so that we can feel the tension between them. Allies, when we're talking about like two people on the same page, ideally, if one of them is feeling vulnerable at the end of the scene, the other one should be too. Right now, that doesn't mean their voices sound the same, because remember, we're moving their voice into vulnerability from a base root. So Han Solo and Luke Skywalker, when they're both at a moment of vulnerability, are going to sound different, right? Like Luke always tended to get a little more uh, weepy and sentimental as things got closer, whereas Han tended to get uncomfortable as things became more vulnerable. So you get the dynamic between the characters if you're not suffering from monomouth and you've created these different voices. When you move into vulnerability, you can feel that engagement, that intimacy building between the characters and the reader, because their voices are uniquely themselves. But thinking about like, so how are these characters changing, and how is that change complementing or harming what I want to do with the scene? So if you want to raise tension with the scene and your characters are starting happy and ending happy, then you are hurting the tension you're wanting to raise in the scene with your emotional model, right? Like, so do things in the scene that make your characters feel that tension, and their voice should change, indicating to the reader that there is tension building in the scene, right? Like, because it's all this big conversation between the reader and the characters.
Okay, so let's get nitty gritty, and
Yeah.
in technical terms, how do you represent that emotion, or any kinds of emotion in dialogue?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Let me clarify. How do I represent it as a writer, or how does the reader see it?
How do you create emotion in dialogue?
Okay, that's great. A lot of that depends on the character. Sorry, I had to kind of gather my thoughts there for a second.
No, I know, I threw it at
We're
you,
just
so
going
I'm
through.
sorry.
No, it's a great question. So, first off, you don't need to learn a different skill to do this, right? Like, as a human, your primary conveyance of how you're feeling is your voice, right? Whether that voice is expressed just purely through body language or whether it's expressed through the words you're using, you know how to do this because you talk all the time. When you're angry at somebody, how you talk to them changes than when you're just having a laugh, right? Like, so you innately have in you what it means to emote differently. The trick is, how do we get that onto the page? And so I really do think it's gonna sound reductive. It's not. It is about taking a step back and understanding who your character's voice is from the beginning. What are the qualities of the voice, right? So I always start a novel with a short story. All of my novels have come out of short stories, and that's not because I think the short story is some grand art form. It's because I need to spend 2,000 words with a character's voice before I can put that character into a full novel. And so there's just some experimenting and getting the base voice down and pushing that character into a scene that's going to force you to change that voice, because you know
That's
not a
so
lot of
sorry.
prep work.
I
It
have
is
to
just doing.
I have to dive in here because this is
Yeah.
so interesting. And I write a lot of flash fiction. I'm not very good at writing short stories, but I do a lot of flash fiction. And until you just said that, I didn't realize quite how many of my stories have come out of flash fiction. So the reason I do flash fiction is because it's a short, sharp snapshot almost of a character on steroids,
Yeah.
because you have to put so much of that character into that very tight amount of words that you have no choice but to almost over represent them. And the two novels that I'm working on next year, The Scent of Death and Murdering Magicians, the very first thing I did with both of those was a piece of flash fiction, because I didn't have the whole novel. And so that's so interesting that you just said that. I'm sorry, I had to, like,
No,
I
it's
was
great.
epiphanizing over here.
And again, like, so to go back to the question that I'm poorly answering, how do you technically do this thing? There is all kinds of, like, think of getting your characters' voices down, especially your protagonist, your antagonist, like your main character's voices down. Think of it as building a relationship with them. And a relationship takes time, right? Like, we get to know people by spending time with them. So you want to spend some time with your characters. And that's why this, like you writing flash fiction, me writing a short story with my character, that's what we're doing. We're just getting acquainted, right? Like, we're getting to know each other a little bit. There's ways you can accelerate that. You can find a picture. Like, I know writers who find a picture of their character and post the picture up somewhere because the visual cue helps them. I tend to have a little chart of, like, here are the 5 adjectives that describe my character's kind of root voice, and I put that up. Once you get familiar with your character, I think of, we at work, we call it putting it in your mouth. So when you write your character, you put that character in your mouth. I've also talked to it about, like, putting on your character's glove. So you, like, but it is like putting on a piece of clothing to write that character's voice. The weird thing is that what you're going to find, where this illustration breaks down, is what you're going to find is that when you're writing a scene, you're changing gloves like every 3 or 4 sentences. So the illustration breaks down, but it's completely true as to what's happening. But so there's technical tricks you can use, right? Pictures of your characters and the base descriptions of your characters. That wheel I was talking about that, like, helps you understand how your characters are moving over time. If you come to the site, I had somebody at the site email me yesterday, can I have a copy of that wheel? I was like, yeah, sure. So if you come to the site, just hit me up on the site and ask for a copy of it. I'll send it to you, because I just literally use a Google Sheet to build it. So all that to say, like, there are these kind of technical tricks you can use, but I don't want to say, like, just use these tricks and it's going to be okay, because the idea is get to know your character, spend some time with them before you decide to write a 500,000 word, you know, historic romance through a jaunt in, like, medieval England. Like, spend time hanging out with your character a little bit first. Short stories, flash fiction is a great way to do that. Writing the first chapter, and making sure there's a ton of dialogue in it, just to get your character's voice down. All those kinds of things can help you launch off on the right foot. And if you can launch off on the right foot, then your work is super easier. As you go through your novel, we can avoid that, like, second, third, and fourth edit where you're rewriting your character's voice over and over again.
Okay, so I am going to ask one last question before I ask the question of the podcast. What advice do you have for managing a large cast of characters?
Large
Because
casts are the best.
yeah,
Yeah.
like, because obviously we've talked about all of these different things that people should be doing, and it seems like a lot of work, and I know people must be feeling probably quite overwhelmed by all of the information. So like, and that's only going to be magnified by 10x if you have a huge cast of characters. So how the fuck do you manage a really
Yeah.
big cast of characters?
So, and let me just, so I have to say, before we talk about how to manage a huge cast of characters, and I'll share with you the major error I made in my first series. But before, before we do that, um, I just want to say, don't be overwhelmed, right? Like, don't be overwhelmed. This is joy, right? Like getting to know your characters is fun. And so don't let it stress you out. And it's going to take a little bit of time and it's going to take a little bit of practice. But this is improving our craft and becoming a better writer, which should be our goal. You know, especially in this world where readers consume obsessive series and like want to read like 15 books from a character, know that you're going to spend a lot of time with this character. So take that as excitement and fun of like, okay, I'm going to dive into who this character is. I think that'll go a long way. If you refuse to stress out about it and think of it more as an adventure and working out your writing muscles, this will be easier. So just to say, like, be positive. It's going to be great. You're going to create amazing characters that the world is going to love, right? Like, so this is just the first step on the journey to doing that. All right.
Also, sorry, just to interject, if anyone can hear like a very odd vibration-y type sound, it's my cat purring. She sleeps on my desk. So
Oh,
yeah,
that's the
sorry to
best.
anybody who can hear purring in the
I love it.
background.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, that's we're having this conversation super early in the morning my time, because my house is so insane during the day that it's like I need to do this at dark 30 in the morning,
Yeah,
because otherwise things are just gonna. Yeah, I
I'm
tend to.
shuddering.
Yeah, I tend to put my own podcast up at like midnight because it's like otherwise the house is insane, and even then I put like a 17-year-old playing PlayStation next to me. So it's just crazy town. So sorry, back to the question. I will try to be less distractible. How do you manage a large cast? So when I wrote my first book, uh, I had a cast of 9 main characters, which I was super excited about. I was so excited about, the rebel in me, which I don't recommend this, but the rebel in me was like, screw genre conventions, screw what everybody's expecting. I'm writing a superhero horror thriller with the lead character being a reporter that's also going to have homeless, magical powered people and monsters, right? Like, so just this crazy, but it made me have this ginormous cast. And I just jumped into it. I wrote short stories for a couple of the characters. I was like, I got their voice. And I just went in. And I spent 6 months. Well, it was my first book. It took me 8 months. I wrote the whole book, you know, edited it, published it. I was super excited and I was exhausted. And I took a 2-month break. And then I came back to write book number 2 in the series. And I had these 9 characters and I could not remember how half of them sounded. It was just, I was like, wait, I haven't written that specific voice for like 6 months and I have no idea how they're supposed to sound. And now I'm in big trouble because I wrote book 4 2 years ago. And book 5 has just been sitting in the back of my brain for like working on the plot. Because much like you said in other podcasts, Sasha, I'm not ready to write a book until I'm ready to write a book. So I got to work that plot out in my head before, and I just cannot figure out how to get these characters to the place that I want them to get to. So I'm just like living with this book in my head for 2 years, and I'm gonna have to go back and read the other books because to get those character voices back. So just diving in to a large cast is not a good idea. So technically, what I would recommend is you need to have something permanent that's going to help you remember those voices a long time. And I wouldn't do this for every single character you're going to interact with, but for your main characters, just take 30 minutes and describe their voice to yourself. Just 3 to 4 adjectives, right? Are they extroverted or introverted? Do they are they fun loving or serious? Do they speak uh, with short words, or do they use long words? Do they have short sentences, or are they rambling on for hours and hours and hours, talking and talking and talking, just filling the page up? Are they a big personality when they enter the room, or do they like to be unnoticed when they enter the room? Right? Like, how do you describe, if you were to describe this character's mannerisms to somebody? What is that like? You don't need a ton, right? Like just 5 short sentences or phrases about the character, not even complete sentences, but just 5 little things that are going to remind you about who the character is. Put it in a chart somewhere for a large cast and give it. What's really nice about doing a large cast of characters is that if you're building that kind of 5-sentence chart, line them up and make sure they're different. If all of your characters are shy, and all of your characters, when they enter a room, want to go unnoticed, and all of your characters are sarcastic, and all of your characters are pessimistic, and all of your characters like to make wisecracks, you're suffering from monomouth because they all sound like you, right? Like, so make sure that they all sound separate when you line them up, and make sure you have that list of adjectives somewhere where you're going to be able to keep it for years. Because, yeah.
You said about the circle thingy that
Mm-hmm.
people can email. Is this part of that?
Yeah, so I did the first, so that just to describe the chart that I use for my own writing is the middle column, right? I will have characters. So if you think of a spreadsheet, the rows are my characters. So I'll just have the first column is just their names. And then I'll skip over like 3 columns, and in the middle column, I'll have root voice across the top. And that middle column, I'll have just like this 5-phrase description of their voice. Sometimes I'll even write a phrase. So like if a character has a catchphrase, or a character has something that like they're going to say, you put it in that. So for example, I was one of the first characters I wrote. I wrote a book called Mark and All the Magical Things, and I really wanted to write. The whole goal of the book was to write a character that has anger issues and watch him move through those, like come to terms with his own anger issues. Um, it was a fun book because he also has conversations with inanimate objects, which is fun. But this, like, he has these. He's there helping him process through his anger. So in his description, underneath his like 5-phrase thing, I had the phrase, just shut up and leave me alone. Because that phrase just like exemplifies who he is, right? Like, just shut up and leave me alone. And then underneath that, I'm stacking all of the voices in that middle column so that I can see if they line up. To the right, I have whatever vulnerability looks like in this story. So if I'm thinking through my story and I'm thinking through like, okay, my characters are going to have moments of intimacy and vulnerability where they're revealing who they truly are and they're letting their guard down. And I'll go like 2 to 3 columns to the right where I'm writing that progression. So when Mark, that character, when his common voice was angry and sullen and explosive and lashing out with a quick fuse, right? Like, if those are my 5 things, I don't actually remember, but that's just off the top of my head. And then I'm moving to the right to vulnerability. I want that anger to transform to humor, and I want him to become slowly less explosive and more accepting. Right. So I'm not just going to go like from explosive to accepting. I'm going to move it gradually. So maybe he goes from like explosive to um, still excitable but hesitant. And then maybe he goes from still excitable to hesitant to um, less judgmental. And then maybe he goes from less judgmental to accepting of others around him. Right. Like, so we're moving from like exposure to vulnerability. And then I'm going to go like 2 or 3 columns in the other way. Right. Like when he's under extreme anxiety and stress, whatever that looks like. So like if you're writing a mystery, extreme anxiety and stress may be struggling with the case. Right. If you're writing a romance, extreme anxiety and stress might be separation from the love interest. Right. If you're writing a drama, extreme anxiety and stress might be um, a struggle with a particular thing in life, like you can't get the house sold. So like, what happens when your character is at the pit of like failure, right? Might be the anxiety and a drama. So like take it to the left, 3 columns of drama. And again, remember you're moving gradually. Like how's this character moving in each column a little bit more toward anxiety and stress? What you're going to end up with is this great chart of like, let's say you've got 9 characters, which is a ton. You've got 9 characters root voice, and then you have how they all change. And then you can start mixing and matching, right? Like, so if character number 5 is your antagonist and character number 1 is your protagonist, you can see like, okay, as my protagonist becomes more secure in who they are and more open in who they are, my antagonist is going to become more stressed and anxious. How do their voices complement and contrast each other? Right, like, and so you start to get this kind of, that's why I call it a wheel, because you're kind of turning but that's the trick I use for
So
casts.
is this template part of your autoresponder sequence? Because this is like 50 Shades of Genius, and if you don't either, oh my god,
yeah. So no, if you sign up for my email list on my website, you get 5 diseases that authors suffer from. Monomouth and stone mouth are 2 of them, and then you end up getting 3 exercises you can do to fix those diseases. But I haven't put the character wheel as part of my autoresponder, but I should.
So, well, if you don't, then you either need to have it as part of your giveaway, because or you need to monetize it, because I would pay good money for this template.
That's
so
funny.
Yeah.
Well, right now I'm just giving it away. So if you come to the site and email me, I'll just email you your own copy of it. So
okay, I am emailing you because I need this in my life. It's genius. Okay, and so very important book. For the love of God, tell me you are writing a non-fiction book about dialogue, a very comprehensive tome that is all about everything you need in dialogue. Because if you say no, I'm gonna have to lynch you.
So it's so funny, Sasha, because let's just I'm just gonna put down the whatever mask I had up, which I don't think I did, but if I did, I'm putting it down. We're moving to the right on my chart. So I'm 2 months into this. Like, this is stuff that I've been doing at work for 6 years, so it all just kind of like comes out from me.
Yes, it needs to come out from you on the page.
Yeah, and by the way, so just to be clear, like, writing simulations is very different than writing novels. So what I'm doing is taking a skill set that we use to write simulations and I'm applying it in a completely different world. So that's why a lot of this, I think, feels strange, because like, on my podcast, like I'll have my friend Rachael on, or I'll have my friend Laura on, and they're all simulation writers too. And to them, this is like, yeah, no, this is what we do. So it's just, all I'm doing is taking a skill set that we use in a different part of the world and bringing it to writing. So that being said, I'm 2 months in. I have started. I am working on a book with Jay Thorne that you've written in the series 9 Things Authors Don't Do.
But these books are short.
They're
I
super
want a
short.
tome. I am demanding a tome.
So
from you.
I'm working slowly, building out, probably in early 2021. My hope is to build a book that says like, okay, from the start of your novel to the end of your novel, let's talk about writing your dialogue. And I'm not like, Robert McKee wrote a tome, right, on dialogue. And so if you want a tome, go read Robert McKee.
No, I don't want his tome. I want your
everything. Everything Robert McKee does is amazing. What I'd rather do is write a practical book that's like, hey, here's how we do this step by step.
Great.
So I am working on that, probably Good. 2021.
That is excellent news.
I am slow. And I am, just as a person, like if you're going to build my character chart, which I actually recommend you do, like build your own, because it's fun. Speaking about like how psychology works, there's nothing more therapeutic than building your own voice chart.
Oh my god! Oh wait! You literally mean? Oh no, I couldn't do that. That would be terrible.
Build your own. How do you respond in moments of anxiety and stress? How do you respond when you're more vulnerable? How do the people around, like this is therapy? Like, how do the people around you do it? How are you interacting with those people, and what tension is that creating? Just to throw more in there, another thing that's great to ask your characters, if you're not getting the character chart and that like the 9 things aren't working for you, you can always go CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, and be like, okay, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected. What's my character thinking? What thoughts, how are those thoughts impacting their feelings? And because they feel that way, why are they behaving the way they behave? Right? Like, so when you're talking about that center root column, that's another way to get at it, is thinking like thoughts, feelings, behaviors. How is that happening? But all that to say, like, um, yeah, part of the reason I'm hesitant to talk about a book writing is because if you were to build my center column, you would find self-deprecating and incredibly self-conscious and constantly worried that everything he's saying is bullcrap. So like that's my character, incredibly apologetic, right? Like that's my character trait. So yeah, so forgive me for being like, I don't know when this is gonna happen. It's gonna. I mix my my self-loathing with a deep fear that nothing will ever get done. So I become extremely productive and obsessive compulsive. So it will happen in 2021. But if you ask me about it again, you'll just get a rambling babble of nervousness.
Oh, I will. I will be asking you about it again. In my column is a demanding bitch, I think is probably one of the things you'd find in mine.
It's awesome. Sasha, I need more of you in my life. I need you to be just calling me and be like, hey, it's the demanding bitch on the phone.
Yeah.
I'm here to find out where your book is.
No, it would be, where is your fucking book? I want the fucking book. You have to, swear words will also be in my column.
That's fantastic.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay, right. We have talked. I cannot believe how long we've talked, because it feels like a second. But
it's been fantastic.
Hasn't it? Yeah, I've had an absolute blast. Okay, so most important question of the podcast. This is the Rebel Author podcast. So tell us about a time you unleashed your inner rebel.
So I've been thinking, I listened to your podcast, like I said, and so I've been thinking about this question a lot, and it's a tough one for me because I gotta say, like, as a systems thinker, who's worked in very traditional spaces, unleashing my inner rebel and like rejecting status quo and trying to see things differently has kind of been my career path for the last 20 years. And there's times where it's gone really, really well and created really, really beautiful things. And then there's times where it's been really painful and created massive failure. So like, I was clergy for a while working in churches, and, as a clergy working in churches, looking at the system of how my tradition did church at that time and saying like, hey, I don't think we need this Sunday morning gathering. Like that was a big rebel move that was seriously painful because it caused me to be like rejected by my profession. So, right, like there's a lot of like, so I think being a rebel is innate in who I am, and it has caused pain and joy. Or like there was a time where we were like, hey, we need to find, like I have my 17-year-old kid now was in first grade, and it was like, hey, we need to find a different way to educate this kid because the systems around us aren't working. So we joined with a whole bunch of other parents, and we built a charter school from scratch that was like arts integrated and based in like a Reggio Emilia style that was like super progressive. And that was a beautiful 5 years. Like, when we finally stepped away from it, there was this existing elementary, middle, and high school there that like is still serving the city around us. So like that's being a rebel sometimes has been really amazing. But all that to say, like, it's hard to pick one moment. So if I was going to say like in my author career, where part of my rebelness, and I'm going to share this story because I think it'll help the hardest thing to do, I think, as an author is figure out what to do with your first book. Because your first book is always super personal. And in my experience so far, everybody's first book is some kind of weird fictional autobiography. I know mine was. So we're taking all these stories we have in life. We're like, I'm going to tell these stories in fiction and people are going to love it. No one loved my stories. So anyway, all that to say, like, my first rebel thing was I had all these short stories, and then I was like, I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to write a fictionalized version of my own experience. And I started to put it into the world, and I started researching because I'm an obsessive researcher. So I started looking at like, how do you publish a book? And I was reading about the traditional way to publish a book, like, find an agent and query letters and all this stuff. And I called a friend, and I was like, who was writing books in the traditional world. And I was like, how do you get an agent? And she was like, well, it's kind of, a lot of it's kind of networking, and it has to do with trust, and you have to build a relationship, and it's about feeling each other out. And I was like, fuck that. Like, I'm 36. I don't have time to like, I'm 36. I got 5 kids. Like, I don't have time to Dude, so that was a big rebel moment for me that drove me to indie publishing. Was just like, I'm just gonna fucking do this thing on my own. Like, I'm gonna build my own audience. I'm gonna do this. Um, yeah, that was one that's worked out for me, right? Like, I wouldn't go back to tradition. This is not me banging on traditional publishing. I think it's a beautiful industry with amazing people who love books and bring fantastic things to life. But for me, there was no other route to go but indie, because I did not have the patience to stand in line. I did just I saw the line of people looking for agents, metaphorical line of people looking for agents and trying to get, and I was like, I'm not standing in that line. So that was a rebel moment for me. But sometimes they backfire. Like when I was writing short stories, I was trying to get them published in other places, and again, I found myself standing in line. And I was like, I'm not standing in line. I don't have time to stand in line. So I started my own uh, short story journal online. It's still running. It's called Short Fiction Break. And I was just like, hey, all authors, come and let's just post our stuff. Like, it's gonna be great. We're gonna have this journal. And like, it blew up pretty quickly. And Short Fiction Break, I was ending up like spending hours every night reading other people's stuff. I'd been an author for like 2 months, and I'm like spending hours reading other people's stuff, like trying to, like, how do I post this? Like, what am I doing? I did it for a year and a half, and finally a good friend named Joe Bunting, who runs The Right Practice, was like, can I take that from you? And I was like, please take it. So, and Joe and his main editor, Alice, do an amazing job over at Short Fiction Break and run it very professionally, far more professionally than I was running it. So that's a time being a rebel kind of backfired on me, where like I got it way in over my head. But yeah, so
That's
anyway.
not a backfire. That is an enormous success. I'm not gonna take any of this bullshit self-deprecating nonsense from you. You're fucking amazing, and I'm not having anything else other than the goddamn book from you. I want that book.
All right. Sasha, I'm going to put a picture of you on my bulletin board right here with the phrase underneath it. Give me the goddamn book, Jeff.
Yeah, yeah, please do.
Use it as motivation.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay, right. Tell listeners where they can find out more about you and your books and your services and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, so the best place to find out about Dialogue Doctor is to go to dialoguedoctor.com. I'm putting out a weekly podcast. The point of the podcast is so look, like working for nonprofits for 15 years before becoming a full-time writer for this company, I made zero money. Right, like my wife and I literally lived on shoestrings, and it was like, can we pay the mortgage this month? Like, it was, and a lot of times we couldn't. Like, it was terrifying financially. We were doing amazing work in communities, but man, that just doesn't pay. So, I know what it is to start an author career with no money, because this is a small business, and we are, launching a small business with no capital can be difficult and frustrating and irritating. So I started doing the podcast to be like, hey, here's what it's like to sit with me for a session. If you can't pay for it, just listen to the podcast. It's free. And the way we're rotating the podcast right now is every other week I put up a session I've done with somebody with their permission. I'm not secretly recording people and putting their work online. So I put up a session I did with somebody, so you can just kind of feel and hear what it's like. The Dialogue Doctor has a YouTube channel as well, where you can watch us edit the thing. So the nice thing about the YouTube channel is that you can actually see the script we're working on. So find the podcast. It's everywhere podcasts are, and you can actually listen to me and other authors talk about this stuff and live edit scripts, so that you can get a feel. Ideally, you can do what we're doing and apply it to your own work. Every other week on the podcast, I bring on a friend. Sometimes it's my mentor, Laura, who taught me how to write dialogue. She and I come on and just talk about hey, what is it? What are tricks and tips and things we've learned about dialogue? Other times it's my good friend Rachael, who she and I used to write simulations together, and then she got stolen by another company to write for them. And she and I analyze scripts together every other week, just for fun, looking at hey, these are amazing moments of dialogues and scripts. How can we take what we're seeing there and apply it to our own work? So there's the podcast, the YouTube channel. If you want to find me personally, I'm on Facebook. Jeff Elkins Writer is my Facebook handle. You can find me on Twitter, JFFELKINS on Twitter. It's my name without the first E, because when I created that Twitter account, I didn't know how social media worked. So I'm there. And you can find my books on Amazon if you want to read one of my books. You know, my fiction is its own thing. Like I said, my rebel nature has gotten me in trouble a lot with fiction, because I don't necessarily have a genre, which is not great for sales and not recommended. So, and I put out a large, for my fiction, I put out a large monthly newsletter, that like every month I give all the stuff that I've been writing. I give recommendations to things that I've been reading. I read a ton, so I usually recommend 2 books in that newsletter every month. And then I'll have 700 to 1,000 words on what is happening in my personal life. So if you want to follow me personally, don't stalk me. Just sign up for my newsletter. Which you can find on Amazon, or my personal website is called vagrantmisunderstandings.com. So you can find my newsletter at vagrantmisunderstandings.com. Yep.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, Sasha, thanks for having me on. This was like a dream come true. I love it.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you also to all of the show's listeners, and a huge thank you to all of the show's patrons. If you would like to get early access to all of the episodes, then you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. I'm Sasha Black. You are listening to Jeff Elkins, and this was the Rebel Author Podcast. Next week, I'll be talking to Scott King, who managed to write a book in 5 days. Yep, I'm not even joking. He wrote the entire thing in 5 days, and that includes all of the outlining and the editing. So the actual writing, I think, was 2 days from memory. So it is going to be a super interesting discussion about how on earth he did that and how you can write faster, which I hope will help all of you doing NaNoWriMo. All right, until next week, have a great writing week. Don't forget to tune in and subscribe on your podcatcher. And when you have a moment, please leave a review.